It seems that cutting off financial support was the last straw. They believed they could say this since I was able to maintain my composure while working many jobs and parenting 4 kids by myself. After that, my mother and my sister Sarah joined in. This is the result of being ignorant. Never again step across this threshold. They both looked at me as they chuckled. I saw my girls on the edge of tears as I turned around. It was more than I could handle. Fine, but you'll regret it. For a brief instant, they both looked at each other in amazement. Oh, then they both gave me the disdainful smile they usually had. Do as you please. For all of us, it makes no difference if you are present or not. Oh, and I'm actually getting married again to a very rich person. I was almost relieved to hear that. I brought my girls back inside and started teaching them right away. We're going to depart a bit sooner than anticipated. It's good of you all to have persevered over the last 6 months. Let's go fill my car with everything we prepared. As expected, Sarah called me often the next day, but I chose to ignore them since I didn't feel compelled to answer. They were obviously in a panic based on the urgent messages and incessant calls. I couldn't help but think to myself I knew it. You can call me Alice Whitman. I recently turned 30. To make ends meet, I'm doing many part-time jobs right now. Actually, I'm a single mom. At the workplace where we both worked, I first met my ex-husband when I was 20 years old. We later became romantically involved. The next year, we were married, and I was fortunate to have 4 kids. My youngest boy recently turned 1 year old, my oldest daughter is 8 years old, and my sons are 7 and 3 years old, respectively. My ex-husband's infidelity when I was pregnant with our 4th child was the cause of our divorce. The oldest of my children was waiting outside the house, looking distressed, when I arrived home early one day from work. When I got there, I was accompanied by my preschool-aged kid, who was 3 years old. However, it was startling to find my kid sitting outside rather than inside the home. I knew right away why. It seemed unbelievable to me. He brought another woman to our house, but how? Our kids were coming home from school at the time. He had ordered my girls to go play outdoors and welcomed his young lover inside our house. As it happens, kids had been playing in a local park and appeared to be enjoying themselves. But it was winter, and the school had told the pupils to get home by 5:00 p.m. They felt uncomfortable since she was still there when they returned. They therefore waited outside the door. The thought that he had abandoned our children to satisfy his own wants was too much for me to bear. I was so angry that I sought a divorce right away. Without any fuss, he signed the divorce papers, but he fled with her and refused to pay any child support or alimony. I was forced to leave with the kids and move into an apartment since the house was his inheritance. After that, my health started to suffer from stress, and I ultimately lost my work. When we got married, I resigned my previous job, and he quit his, probably to escape detection. I was saddened and furious when he and that woman stopped communicating. I began taking part-time jobs, though, because I still needed to provide for my kids. To make ends meet during the day, I stacked shelves at a drugstore and worked as a cashier at a supermarket, but it wasn't enough. I occasionally made a little extra cash by working at night at a friend's pub. A friend's sister helped watch my kids while I worked at night, and I gave her what I could. Then, after a year of hardship, I gave birth to my youngest boy, my 4th kid. Somehow, I made it through the hectic days that followed. I got a call one day from an unidentified number. I dismissed it, assuming it was a telemarketer or spam call. However, the number continued to show up. I was curious, so I searched for it online, but it wasn't in any telemarketing or spam databases. I ignored it, assuming it was an incorrect number. Until I ran into Sarah for the first time in years one day while working my regular shift at the supermarket. I smiled as I welcomed her, even though my face stiffened up. "Hey, how did you know I was working here, and where did you get my phone number?" Sarah grinned as if she was proud of herself. I hired a detective because I had money. However, I only requested them to acquire your number since I didn't want to spend too much. I phoned you several times, but you never answered. I thus paid more to have them find your workplace. I was taken aback. Suddenly, Sarah, who had never given a damn about me, wanted to locate me. I made an effort to ignore the eerie expression in her eyes. Call me after your shift. Although I didn't want to become involved, I was concerned that she may involve my kids because she had gone to such pains to contact me. After work, I reluctantly gave her number a call. I'd want to get together and chat. Let's get together at the local diner. Regardless, you're free, right? She had no idea that I was divorced or had children. Sorry, I need to pick up my 2 youngest sons from daycare, and my 2 oldest are already home from school. After a little silence, she started laughing. Are you married and have children? You are the kind of person who no one would want to marry. Wait, do you even have children or just leave them with your husband? I could sense her sarcastic disdain over the phone as she snickered. I felt humiliated and angry and my cheeks burned. She was resurrecting old scars, even though I had worked hard to move on from my ex. It's none of your business. I have nothing to say to you. Don't contact me again. I hung up and immediately blocked her number. It all happened in just seconds, but I felt utterly drained, my shoulders heaving with exhaustion. I thought I was finally free from the chains of my past. Remembering the painful childhood I had shared with her and my mother, my stomach turned with nausea. I shook my head, pushing the thoughts away as I hurried to pick up my kids. That night passed peacefully with my children without seeing Sarah, but Sarah wasn't one to give up easily. What's taking so long? Hurry up already. About a month after an argument, I noticed movers next door and wondered if I had new neighbors. To my horror, I saw Sarah and my mother stepping out of the moving truck. I hadn't spoken to my mother in years. She looked at me with the same disdainful eyes I remembered. Let me guess, you got kicked out with your kid after your husband cheated on you. Honestly, look at you. An ugly duckling will always be an ugly duckling. Your kids are no different from you. Never swans, always just filthy little ducks. My heart pounded faster as I felt a familiar icy chill run down my spine, but I kept my composure and asked why they had moved next door. It turned out that my mother had hired a detective to locate my address. You ignored our calls and blocked us, so we had to take drastic measures. Mom's health isn't great. She needs a lot of help now. We're sisters, after all. It's our responsibility to support her together. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Why should I, after everything, have to take care of the mother who never cared for me? I felt a wave of anger that made my hands tremble. When have either of you ever done anything for me? They looked at me as if I were some ungrateful servant. They acted like family now, expecting me to help after treating me like a burden for so long. When I voiced my frustration, Sarah grabbed my arm and glared at me. It's your duty. Children are supposed to care for their aging parents. Don't you understand that? I yanked my arm free and stormed inside, locking the door behind me. They pounded on the door, but I ignored them. My sons looked at me, one anxiously, the other with an innocent smile. I hugged them tightly, promising myself that I would protect them no matter what. After a while, they gave up and went back to their moving tasks. Taking the opportunity, I quickly loaded the kids in the car and drove to daycare. At work, as I changed into my uniform, a colleague, a dear friend from high school, noticed my distress. She was one of the few who knew how badly my family had treated me. I couldn't help but vent my frustration. My mom and sister tracked me down and moved next door, saying I need to take care of my mom. She was outraged. Hey, ignore them. They've treated you horribly for so long. They don't deserve anything from you. Her anger on my behalf gave me a small sense of relief. Back in high school, I had worked multiple jobs just to cover my tuition and barely managed to graduate. I had wanted to go to college, but my mother interfered and it became impossible. My friend from high school had gone on to college and married into a stable, supportive family. Though we had been separated for a time, she was now my closest friend and a fellow working mom. She had once been a stay-at-home mom, but eventually returned to work part-time for her own fulfillment. Sharing my frustrations with her gave me a brief respite from the overwhelming stress. But that relief didn't last long. When I got home, my mother and sister were waiting outside my door, fuming. "You should be helping with my care. You know exactly my joints have been aching and I can barely work. You need to start driving me everywhere." I frowned. My mother looked perfectly healthy, so it was obvious she just wanted to make her life easier. Frustrated, I pushed past them and went inside, locking the door. They continued yelling outside, but eventually someone must have called the police and they were told to leave. The officer, sympathetic to my situation, warned them to stop harassing me. But things didn't end there. Shortly after, my brother-in-law, who had been living with Sarah's family, returned as well. He and Sarah joined forces, belittling me for my lack of a college degree and treating me like an outcast. Moving wasn't an option because of financial restraints, and they constantly ridiculed me as a family disgrace. Sarah's husband even sided with her, laughing at me every chance he got. If I ever spoke up, he would shout at me to stay in my place. I felt powerless and cornered. My mother, despite being in good health, demanded I drive her to her part-time job twice a week. She even insisted I take her to her regular doctor's appointments, and I was forced to cover all her medical expenses. Even when I fell sick, I couldn't afford to see a doctor, while she received the best care on my dime. One day she slipped and broke her leg, and it turned out she needed surgery. "You should pay for it. After all, I took care of you when you were little." Her logic was absurd. She only took me to the doctor a handful of times and hardly spent anything on me growing up. "You're being ridiculous," I said. She looked at me, her face twisting in anger. "How dare you say that? Do you have any idea what I went through raising you?" I felt despair wash over me. While my mother was always comfortable financially, she denied me basic support. Sarah, on the other hand, got the best of everything: private education, music lessons, and tutoring. My mother rarely even attended events or activities I was involved in. For school activities, she only ever showed up for Sarah. Even for my high school graduation, I had to cover my tuition on my own, barely managing to make it. I had dreamed of going to college, but my mother refused to support me financially. My high school counselor eventually persuaded her to let me attend high school at the very least. I worked after school to pay my way, trying to keep up with my studies in a demanding environment. Despite the hardship, I graduated with good grades, but my mother never allowed me to pursue higher education. Eventually, I left home and started working, glad to finally be free from her oppressive grip. I could finally buy my own clothes and didn't have to wear Sarah's hand-me-downs anymore. While I built my life, Sarah thrived in the comfort provided by our mother's favoritism. Despite everything, I managed to find peace after leaving home, and compared to the hardships I'd faced, my ex's betrayal seemed almost trivial. Of course, it would have been nice if he had paid child support, but I didn't expect anything. Why, after all of this, should I now have to take care of my mother? One day, while waiting in line to pay for my mother's medical bills, I remembered all the pain she caused me. I turned around and left, ignoring her calls as I drove off. "Wait, come back here." She hobbled after me with her crutches, yelling as I sped away. She could easily call a cab. With Sarah's dual jobs and my mother's part-time income, they had enough. I felt a small thrill of satisfaction as I drove away, finally asserting myself. But my actions only fueled their anger further. When I got home, I saw Sarah scolding my daughters, accusing me of abandoning our mother. "Your mom is a terrible person. She left your grandma at the hospital without paying a cent." I rushed outside and shielded my kids from her wrath. This isn't their concern, and Mom makes enough to pay for her own expenses. I've reached my limit. Leave us alone. My mother stepped out and began shouting insults, her voice echoing through the apartment complex. You're an embarrassment. You're not my daughter. I don't need someone as heartless as you in my life. This is it. We're done, she declared. You're disowned, she said, as if it were some victory for her. I couldn't help but feel a strange relief as I stared at her smug face. Sarah joined in, sneering as they laughed together. See? Low education, low class. Never cross this threshold again. I glanced back at my daughters, who looked on the verge of tears. Fine, if that's what you want, but you're going to regret this. They exchanged a surprised glance before breaking into smug smiles. Go ahead. Do what you want. We don't need you around. Oh, and just so you know, I'm getting remarried to someone wealthy, so we don't need you at all. Surprisingly, this news brought me a sense of relief. I took my daughters back inside and quietly instructed them, We're leaving tonight. You've all been so strong for the last 6 months. Go pack your things and load them into the car. To avoid suspicion, I decided to wait until Sarah left for her night shift, and my brother-in-law was distracted. Once they were gone, we packed as much as we could into the car and slipped away under the cover of night. As expected, the next morning my phone lit up with a flood of missed calls and messages from Sarah, but I ignored every call. The relentless messages showed just how panicked they were. I thought, deep down, they had always needed me more than they'd ever admit. I had planned this move for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to escape. Financial constraints and the fully occupied apartments in the area had delayed my plans, but now it was time. I had saved every penny I could, waiting for an opening, and recently an apartment in a different district became available. I quickly secured it, knowing this would be our sanctuary. My daughters would be able to start fresh away from my family's toxicity. We arrived at our new home, exhausted but at peace for the first time in years. A week later, I called Sarah, who answered immediately, her voice sharp with irritation. Finally, where have you been? I hope you're ready to explain everything. Sure, I'll explain, but don't expect any help from me. I cut her off before she could argue, hung up, and immediately blocked her number again. I didn't need to explain myself, but I wanted to prevent any more harassment, just in case she tried hiring another detective. I knew she didn't have much money left. As life slowly began to settle, one weekend I left the kids with friends and decided to meet with my family once more to settle things. I waited at a local diner. When they arrived, they looked eager for confrontation. The police came to your old apartment. You didn't tell them where you went, did you? Calm down, here, have some tea, I said, but that only fueled her anger. While my mother suddenly adopted a soft tone, she said, Look, sweetheart, I didn't mean all those things I said. You're my daughter. We're family, but things are tight. Would you mind loaning us a little money? The hypocrisy was breathtaking. After all their disdain, now they were suddenly interested because they needed cash. I had filed a police report myself about Sarah's suspicious behavior at work. Why wouldn't the police get involved? You've been stealing, I said. Sarah fell silent. I'd always wondered why she suddenly took on night work, despite her husband's job supposedly paying well. Then an astonishing revelation came to light. Sarah had been fired for embezzlement. She had hidden this from her husband, who thought her job was her main source of income. I realized that their sudden interest in finding me was to avoid responsibility, to make me care for our mother. They had no intention of shouldering any burden themselves. Sarah had concocted a plan to have our mother babysit her kids, while she claimed she worked extra hours for our mother's medical expenses. Instead, she intended for me to take on all the caregiving and financial responsibilities. Manes secretly confirmed this one day, mentioning how her mother often came home late and drained. Concerned, she had confided in one of my daughters, who then told me. Additionally, Sarah had been stealing from clients at her night shop. I had already informed the police of her actions when I moved. I asked them to hold off on any investigations until my children and I were settled in our new home. Today, Sarah's kids were safe and cared for while Sarah faced her own consequences. My mother was just as guilty because she covered for Sarah and ignored what she was doing. However, they accused me of abandoning them and viewed me as the bad guy. Sarah had penned off association land for financial gain, stealing not just from our community, but also from our clients. My niece told my daughter that she had also seen her mother act unethically. The police ultimately took action in response to community complaints. My family eventually acknowledged the accusations when I questioned them about it, their faces displaying embarrassment. I knew then that the repercussions would ultimately catch up with them. They risked public humiliation in addition to potential arrests because the cops were following them everywhere. Knowing that I had started down the path to peace for myself and my kids, I walked out of the diner feeling lighter than before. I felt as though I had closed a chapter I had never wanted to read as I left the diner. When I got home, my kids were playing happily, oblivious to the family turmoil that had finally ended. I was able to breathe freely for the first time in years. My dad had thrown his whole weight behind it. He wanted justice for me and his grandkids, so he promised to pay for any expenses incurred in the civil litigation. I couldn't express how appreciative I was of his attempt to make up for all the time we had missed. I saw my kids giggling carelessly as they rushed around the yard. I quietly promised myself that I would never allow someone to hurt them again as I saw their joy. A few weeks later, my former family started to feel the effects of what I had done. Sarah's theft had been discovered in her neighborhood, and she was facing civil prosecution. Her reputation was ruined. When they realized how manipulative she was, the family members who had previously mocked me started to turn away. After feeling invincible with her authority, my mother was suddenly alone and overburdened with debt. She had to give up the luxury she had previously taken for granted and simplify her life. I kept up my new employment in the meantime, where I was treated with respect and felt appreciated. One day at a time, I gradually created a tranquil existence that I never imagined having. I smiled every morning as I dropped my kids off at school, knowing they were secure and free to follow their aspirations. They were growing up in a loving, stable environment, and I was at last the mother I had always wanted to be. I stayed in close contact with my father. He became a constant presence in my children's life, and we met frequently. The children loved their grandfather, who was always full of knowledge and stories to impart. As my family recovered, I saw that every day moved us one step closer to true happiness and away from the suffering. Although my life had been challenging, I had come out stronger and more resilient as a result. I could now look forward to a bright future since I had conquered the darkness of my past. When I saw my kids' happy expressions, I realized that all of the hardships had been worthwhile. Ultimately, the best present I could ever offer them was that we were free.